On the American frontier, winter could become deadly if the fire went out at night. In one remote prairie settlement where trees were almost non-existent, settlers relied on fuel that burned far too quickly. But one small observation would lead to an idea that changed how several families survived the cold. If you enjoy frontier history, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. In the early 1880s, the American frontier still contained vast regions that had barely begun to feel the presence of permanent settlement. One of those places was a quiet stretch of grassland in eastern Wyoming known locally as Prairie Basin. To travelers passing through, it seemed endless. Rolling waves of prairie grass stretched toward the horizon in every direction, broken only by small creeks, sandy ridges, and the constant movement of wind across the land. Unlike the wooded landscapes of the eastern states, Prairie Basin offered almost no trees. The few cottonwoods that grew along creek banks were thin and scattered, and they disappeared quickly once settlers arrived. For people who had come from places like Ohio, Illinois, or Indiana, the landscape looked unfamiliar and strangely empty. They had brought with them farming tools, wagons, and iron stoves designed to burn wood, but here there was very little wood to burn. The region had only recently begun attracting homesteaders. After the expansion of railroad routes further south, rumors of open land began to circulate through farming communities across the Midwest. Under the Homestead Act, families could claim 160 acres of land if they were willing to live on it and work it for several years. For many people struggling with debt or overcrowded farmland back east, the promise of free land sounded like a second chance. So wagons began moving west. By the beginning of the decade, a thin scattering of homesteads appeared across Prairie Basin. They were small, isolated claims separated by miles of grassland. Most settlers built simple sod houses at first, cutting blocks of earth and stacking them into thick walls that could hold warmth during the winter. Roofs were often made of timber beams covered with grass and packed soil. These homes were not elegant, but they protected families from the relentless wind that swept across the plains. Life on the prairie demanded constant labor. In spring and summer, settlers plowed fields, planted crops, and repaired fences. Water had to be carried from creeks or shallow wells. Livestock needed care, and gardens required attention. Every day was filled with practical work meant to turn open land into a functioning farm. But even during the warmer months, one problem slowly became impossible to ignore: fuel. In the wooded regions where many settlers had grown up, firewood had always been easy to find. Farmers could cut trees from nearby forests or gather fallen branches for their stoves. On the prairie, however, trees were rare. The few that existed along creeks were quickly cut down by the first families who arrived. Within a short time, even those limited sources of wood were gone. Some settlers attempted to haul firewood from distant railroad towns. The nearest settlement with regular wood shipments was a small supply stop called Silver Creek, located almost 180 miles away. The journey required several days with a wagon, and the cost of transporting wood over such distance made it impractical for most homesteaders. Firewood became a luxury few could afford. Yet winter on the plains was unforgiving. By late autumn, the prairie winds grew colder and more violent. Frost appeared across the grass before sunrise, and the sky often turned gray with approaching storms. Experienced settlers knew what that meant. Within weeks, blizzards would begin sweeping across the open land, sometimes without warning. Temperatures during these winters could fall to levels few eastern farmers had ever experienced. Bitter winds pushed through cracks in sod walls, and snowdrifts piled against doors and windows. Without a working stove and a steady supply of fuel, a house could become dangerously cold within hours. The settlers of Prairie Basin quickly learned that surviving winter required creativity. One resource, though unusual, was abundant across the grasslands. For generations, herds of cattle and wild animals had roamed the prairie. Over time, they left behind countless dried pieces of dung scattered across the ground. Under the hot summer sun, these pieces hardened into flat, lightweight discs. At first, many settlers ignored them, seeing them as little more than waste. But eventually someone tried burning them. The dried dung caught fire easily. It burned with a short, hot flame and produced very little ash. Soon many families across the plains began collecting these pieces as fuel. They became known locally as prairie chips. During the warmer months, settlers walked across the grasslands gathering them into sacks or wheelbarrows, storing them in small sheds beside their homes. By the time winter arrived, many homesteads had built piles of prairie chips meant to keep their stoves burning for months. The system worked, but it had a serious flaw. Prairie chips burned extremely fast. A single chip placed in a stove might produce heat for only a few minutes before crumbling into ash. Keeping a steady fire required constant attention. Throughout the day, someone needed to add more fuel every few minutes. At night, the problem became even worse. While families slept, The fire often burned through the remaining fuel and died out completely. When that happened, the inside of a house could grow dangerously cold before morning. Many settlers remembered waking before dawn to find frost forming inside their own homes. The iron stove would sit cold and dark in the corner while the prairie wind rattled the walls outside. Rebuilding a fire in those conditions could take precious time, and until the flames returned the house remained bitterly cold. For families with children, the problem was frightening. Some tried staying awake in shifts during the night, feeding the stove every half hour to keep the fire alive. Others piled extra blankets over their beds and hoped the embers would survive until morning. But no matter how careful they were, prairie chip fires rarely lasted long enough. Among the scattered homesteads near Dry Cottonwood Creek lived a woman who understood this problem better than most. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was 34 years old and lived alone on a small homestead several miles south of the creek. Like many settlers in Prairie Basin, she had originally traveled west with her husband in search of land and opportunity. They had built their sod house together the previous year and begun the difficult process of turning the claim into a working farm. But life on the frontier was unpredictable. During the late summer after their arrival, Clara's husband fell ill with a severe fever that swept through several nearby settlements. Medical help was far away, and within a few days he was gone. By the time autumn arrived, Clara found herself alone on the homestead they had planned to build together. Leaving the land was possible, but she chose not to. Instead, she continued working the claim herself. Her days were filled with the same routine as every other settler. She repaired fences, tended a small garden, cared for 2 horses, and gathered prairie chips for winter fuel. The work was difficult for one person, but Clara approached it with quiet determination. When the first winter arrived after her husband's death, she discovered just how challenging prairie life could become. Each night she fed the stove again and again, trying to keep the fire alive long enough to warm the small sod house. Sometimes she fell asleep from exhaustion and woke hours later to a cold room and a dead fire. On the coldest mornings, frost formed along the inside walls, and her breath turned white in the air. By the time spring finally returned to Prairie Basin, Clara had survived the winter, but the experience left a clear impression on her mind. The prairie provided fuel, but the fuel did not last. If she intended to stay on the homestead, she would have to find a better way to keep the fire burning through the long winter nights. When spring finally returned to Prairie Basin, the prairie changed almost overnight. Snow melted across the grasslands, and the cold winds that had ruled the winter slowly softened. The frozen ground began to dry beneath the sun, and settlers across the valley stepped outside to begin the long season of work once again. For Clara Whitmore, spring meant many things. The small garden behind her sod house needed to be prepared. Fences damaged by winter winds had to be repaired. The horses needed attention, and the tools stored through the cold months had to be cleaned and returned to use. But one task returned every year without fail: fuel collection. Prairie chips that had survived the winter lay scattered across the grasslands. During the warm months, settlers walked long distances across the prairie gathering them by hand. Some carried canvas sacks over their shoulders. Others pushed small wheelbarrows across the uneven ground. It was slow and repetitive work, but every piece collected meant warmth during the next winter. Clara followed the same routine. In the early weeks of April, when the ground had dried enough to walk easily, she began her daily trips across the prairie. She moved slowly across the open land, bending to pick up the flat, dried pieces scattered among the grass. The prairie wind moved constantly around her, carrying the scent of dust and new growth. 4 hours at a time she worked alone in the quiet landscape. As the weeks passed, her chip pile near the homestead began to grow again. The small shed beside her sod house slowly filled with the fuel she would rely on once winter returned. It was during these long days of collecting that Clara began to notice something unusual. Not all prairie chips were the same. Some pieces felt light and brittle, breaking easily in her hands. These were the most common kind, the fresh chips left by cattle during the previous year. They dried quickly in the sun and burned easily in the stove. But occasionally she found others that were different. These pieces were darker, heavier, and much harder than the rest. Some had clearly been lying on the prairie for several seasons. Others appeared to have been pressed into the ground by the weight of cattle hooves, or by the pressure of large piles stacked on top of them. When Clara picked these older pieces up, she could feel the difference immediately. They were dense. At first, she simply placed them into her sack with the others, thinking little about it. But one afternoon, while emptying her collection beside the shed, she paused for a moment to examine a few of these pieces more closely. They looked almost like small compressed discs. Their surfaces were smooth and solid, and they felt far stronger than the fragile chips she normally collected. Clara set them aside. Later that evening, as she prepared a small fire in her iron stove, she decided to test them. She placed one of the dense chips among the normal ones and watched. The difference became obvious almost immediately. The ordinary chips caught fire quickly, producing the short flames she had seen all winter. Within minutes they had burned away, leaving only thin grey ash. But the compressed piece behaved differently. It burned more slowly. Instead of a quick flame, it produced a steady heat that lasted much longer than the others. The fire remained strong while the other chips disappeared around it. Clara leaned closer to the stove, watching carefully. By the time the dense chip finally burned out, several minutes had passed beyond what she expected from a normal pace. That night she began thinking about the difference. Over the following weeks she continued collecting prairie chips, but now she paid closer attention to their condition. Whenever she found an older or compressed piece, she placed it into a separate pile beside the shed. Gradually a pattern began to appear. The denser pieces consistently burned longer in the stove. The reason seemed simple enough. When the material was compressed, there was less airspace inside it. The fire moved through it more slowly, and the heat lasted longer. Clara began to wonder about something else. If these older pieces burned longer because they had been compressed by time or pressure, then perhaps the same result could be created deliberately. The idea stayed with her as she worked. One afternoon, while organizing the piles beside the shed, Clara picked up several fresh prairie chips that were still slightly flexible from recent drying. Instead of placing them into the loose pile, she stacked them on top of one another. She pressed down with her hands. The pieces flattened slightly but did not stay together. They needed more pressure. A short distance from the homestead, dry Cartonwood Creek wound quietly through the prairie. Along its banks were scattered stones carried by water over many years. Some were small and rounded, but occasionally Clara found flat pieces of sandstone lying among the sand and gravel. During one of her walks to the creek, she noticed a slab of sandstone partially buried in the dry bank. It was wide, flat, and heavy, with a smooth surface worn by water. She lifted it carefully. The stone was large enough to cover several stack chips at once. Clara carried it back to the homestead. That evening she began her first real experiment. She stacked several prairie chips together on the ground beside the shed. Then she placed the flat sandstone slab on top and pressed down with her weight. The soft pieces compressed beneath the stone, flattening into a thicker disc. To keep them together, Clara tied the stack with a length of twisted prairie grass. Then she set it aside in the sunlight to dry. Over the next several days she repeated the process. Soon a small row of pressed discs lay drying beside the shed. But Clara was not finished experimenting. While working along an old wagon trail near the prairie edge, she noticed something scattered along the ground that few settlers paid attention to. Years earlier, supply wagons traveling across the region had occasionally carried sacks of coal from distant mines. Sometimes small pieces fell from the wagons along the rough trail. Over time, those fragments had broken down into small black grains that mixed with the dust of the road. Clara gathered a handful of the material and rubbed it between her fingers. It crumbled into fine powder, almost like black sand. She brought a small amount back to the homestead. When she prepared her next batch of pressed fuel, Clara sprinkled a small quantity of the crushed coal dust between the layers of prairie chips before pressing them together with the sandstone slab. The powder filled the tiny spaces between the fibers of the dried material. Once compressed, the discs became noticeably heavier and more solid. She began calling them fuel bricks. For the next 2 weeks the bricks remained in the sun beside the shed. The prairie wind helped dry them slowly, hardening the compressed material into thick, dense discs. When they were finally ready, Clara carried one of them inside. The iron stove stood waiting in the corner of the sod house, just as it had during the long winter nights. Clara built a small fire using a few loose prairie chips, allowing the flames to grow strong enough to ignite new fuel. Then she placed the first pressed brick into the fire. She sat quietly beside the stove and watched. The brick caught slowly, much more gradually than the loose chips. For several minutes the flames worked across its surface. Instead of burning away quickly, the compressed disc began glowing with steady heat. Time passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The fire continued burning. Clara leaned forward, studying the stove carefully. The brick held together, releasing heat steadily instead of collapsing into ash. The test continued far longer than any ordinary prairie chip. By the time the brick finally finished burning, Clara realized something important had happened. The fire in her stove had lasted far longer than usual. And beneath the flames, a deep layer of glowing coals had begun to form. The first time Clara Whitmore saw the glowing coals left behind by one of her pressed fuel bricks, she did not immediately understand how important the discovery might become. She only knew that the fire in her stove had lasted far longer than the loose prairie chips she had burned all winter. That evening she decided to try again. Over the following days, she continued experimenting with the new bricks she had made beside the shed. Each time she lit a fire, she paid careful attention to how long the flames lasted and what remained afterward in the stove. The difference became clearer with every test. A loose prairie chip burned quickly. It caught fire almost instantly, flared brightly for a short moment, and then collapsed into a small pile of grey ash. In most cases, the entire process lasted no more than 5 minutes. But the pressed bricks behaved very differently. Because the material inside them had been compressed tightly, the fire moved slowly across the surface instead of burning through the entire piece at once. The heat built gradually, spreading from the outside toward the center. One brick burned for nearly 40 minutes before it finally crumbled. Clara began comparing the results more carefully. She placed several loose chips into the stove and watched them burn together. Even when the total weight was similar to one brick, the loose pieces burned quickly and left only weak embers behind. The pressed bricks, however, created something new. At the center of the fire, a thick bed of glowing coals formed. These coals remained hot long after the flames faded. Instead of disappearing quickly like the loose chips, they held their heat deep inside the stove. Clara realized that this coal bed might solve the problem she had struggled with all winter. The greatest difficulty with prairie chip fires had never been starting them. Lighting a stove was simple. The real problem came during the night when the fire died out before morning. If the coals from a fuel brick remained hot long enough, the fire might survive until sunrise. To test this idea, Clara waited until evening. She burned 2 of the pressed bricks in her stove until they reached the glowing coal stage. The flames slowly faded, leaving a thick layer of red embers spread across the bottom of the stove. Then she tried something she had seen farmers do with wood fires back east. She covered the coals with ash. Using a small iron shovel, Clara gently spread the stove's remaining ash across the glowing surface. The ash reduced the flow of air reaching the coals, slowing their burn while keeping the heat trapped inside. For an extra layer of insulation, she added a thin covering of dry sand from the bank of dry Cartonwood Creek. The sand settled on top of the ash, sealing the heat even further. When she finished, the stove appeared almost empty. But inside, the coals continued glowing beneath the ash and sand. Clara waited. Every hour or so she checked the stove carefully. At first, the coals remained bright beneath the cover. Several hours later, they were dimmer but still warm. When she gently blew across the surface, a faint red glow returned beneath the ash. The test lasted through the entire night. Before sunrise, Clara returned to the stove and opened the door. The coals were still alive. They were not blazing, but they had not died either. When she added a handful of loose prairie chips on top, the fire returned quickly. Within minutes, flames filled the stove again. Clara sat quietly in the warm light of the early morning and understood what had happened. The pressed fuel bricks had created a coal bed strong enough to survive the night. For the first time since arriving on the prairie, the fire in her home had not gone out before morning. As summer continued, Clara refined her method. She adjusted the size of the bricks and the amount of coal dust she mixed between the layers. She practiced stacking them inside the stove in ways that produced the strongest bed of coals. Gradually, the system became reliable. By the time autumn approached, Clara had filled her small shed with dozens of the pressed fuel bricks. Each one represented nearly an hour of steady heat once it reached full burn. The coming winter would test whether the idea truly worked. That winter arrived earlier than anyone expected. In late October, the winds began to shift across Prairie Basin. The sky darkened for days at a time as cold air moved down from the northern plains. Snowstorms followed soon after, sweeping across the open grasslands with sudden violence. The settlers of Prairie Basin recognized the signs quickly. A harsh winter was coming. By December, the temperature had fallen far below freezing. Strong winds pushed snow across the prairie in thick waves that sometimes buried fences and wagon paths overnight. Inside the scattered sod houses across the basin, settlers struggled to keep their fires alive. Prairie chip piles that seemed large during summer began disappearing quickly once the cold arrived. Families fed their stoves constantly throughout the night, hoping the flames would last until morning. But the fires often failed. Many mornings began with cold stoves and freezing rooms while settlers struggled to rebuild the flames. At Clara Whitmore's homestead, the situation was different. Each evening she placed several fuel bricks into the stove and allowed them to burn slowly until a deep coal bed formed. Before going to sleep, she carefully covered the coals with ash and sand, sealing the heat inside just as she had practiced during the summer tests. Then she waited for morning. Night after night the coals survived. When Clara woke before sunrise, she opened the stove and added fresh chips or another brick. Within minutes the fire returned, warming the small sod house as the prairie wind howled outside. The system worked. By January, the winter had grown even more severe. Blizzards swept across Prairie Basin with almost no warning. Temperatures plunged toward levels few settlers had ever experienced. One morning the air outside measured nearly 40 degrees below zero. The wind cut across the prairie like a blade. Inside her house, Clara checked the stove just before sunrise. The coals still glowed beneath the ash and sand. She added 2 fresh fuel bricks and waited. The fire returned quickly, filling the stove with steady heat. Within half an hour, the inside of the sod house was warm again while the storm continued outside. Clara's experiment had passed its greatest test. Even in the harshest cold the prairie could produce, her fire continued burning. But beyond the walls of her small homestead, many of her neighbors were still struggling to keep their own fires alive. By the middle of that winter, the difference between Clara Whitmore's homestead and the surrounding farms had become difficult to ignore. Across Prairie Basin, settlers struggled against the cold that swept across the open grasslands. Many families had collected large piles of prairie chips during the summer, believing the fuel would last through the winter months. But the severe cold forced them to burn more fuel than expected. Night after night, stoves demanded constant attention. The loose prairie chips burned quickly, and many settlers found themselves waking repeatedly during the night to feed their fires. Even with this effort, the flames often died out before morning. When that happened, the houses grew dangerously cold until a new fire could be started. Some mornings the smoke rising from prairie chimneys was thin or delayed, a sign that families were struggling to rebuild their fires in freezing homes. At Clara's homestead, the situation remained steady. Her stove burned slowly through the pressed fuel bricks she had prepared during the summer. Each brick produced a deep bed of coals, and each night those coals were carefully covered with ash and sand before she went to sleep. When morning came, the heat remained waiting beneath the surface. She only needed to add fresh fuel to bring the fire back to life. During the harshest weeks of winter, this difference began attracting attention. One afternoon, after a particularly violent snowstorm had swept across Prairie Basin, a neighbor named Thomas Keller arrived at Clara's door. His homestead stood several miles to the north, and the journey through the drifting snow had clearly exhausted him. When Clara opened the door, he stepped inside quickly, brushing frost from his coat. The warmth inside the sod house surprised him immediately. "Your fire's still burning," he said, looking toward the iron stove glowing steadily in the corner. Clara nodded and offered him a seat near the warmth. Thomas explained that his own stove had gone cold earlier that morning after the night fire burned out. He had managed to relight it, but the fuel in his shed was disappearing faster than he had expected. Before leaving, he asked how she managed to keep her fire alive through the night. Clara showed him. She opened the stove carefully and explained how the pressed fuel bricks burned differently than loose prairie chips. She described the process of stacking the chips, compressing them beneath the sandstone slab, and mixing the layers with crushed coal dust collected from the old wagon trail. Thomas listened closely as she spoke. Then she showed him the final step. When the fire reached its coal stage in the evening, the embers were covered with ash and a thin layer of sand from the creek bank. This slowed the burning process and allowed the coals to remain hot for many hours. Thomas studied the stove quietly. Before leaving, he asked if he could try making the fuel bricks himself. Clara agreed and showed him the small stack she still kept in her shed. She explained how the chips needed to be pressed while still slightly flexible, and how the bricks should be left to dry completely before burning. A few days later, Thomas returned to his homestead and began experimenting with the same method. Word traveled slowly across Prairie Basin, carried mostly through quiet conversations between neighbors. Within weeks, a few more settlers visited Clara's homestead to see the method for themselves. Some were skeptical at first, but the results were difficult to argue with. Each time someone stepped inside her house during the winter storms, they found the same thing waiting inside, a steady fire and a warm room while the prairie wind howled outside. Gradually, other families began making their own pressed fuel bricks. They used whatever flat stones they could find for pressing. Some added small amounts of crushed coal dust when they could gather it from the wagon trail. Others simply relied on the compression of the prairie chips themselves. The technique spread quietly from one homestead to another. By late winter, several families across Prairie Basin were using the same method to maintain their fires. The improvement was immediately noticeable. With fuel bricks burning longer and producing stronger coal beds, settlers no longer needed to feed their stoves constantly through the night. The fires lasted longer. The houses stayed warmer. And perhaps most importantly, the amount of fuel needed for the winter decreased. Instead of collecting enormous piles of loose prairie chips, settlers now required far fewer pressed bricks to produce the same amount of heat. The time saved during the summer collection season could be spent repairing homes, tending gardens, or expanding livestock pens. For many families, the small discovery meant more than just warmth. It meant stability. By the time spring returned to Prairie Basin, The worst of the winter storms had passed. Snow slowly melted across the prairie, revealing the grass beneath and the long wagon tracks leading between scattered homesteads. The settlers who had struggled through the harsh months stepped outside again to begin another year of work. Clara Whitmore returned to the routine she knew well. She repaired fences damaged by winter winds, prepared the garden soil, and cared for the horses that had survived the cold season beside her. The pressed fuel bricks remained part of her daily life. Throughout the spring, she continued collecting prairie chips and pressing them beneath the sandstone slab beside a shed. Each new brick represented warmth for the coming winter. Neighbors occasionally stopped by while she worked, asking questions or sharing their own results from the method they had learned. Clara listened politely, but she never treated the technique as anything unusual. To her, it had simply been a practical solution to a difficult problem. The prairie had offered limited resources, and survival required careful observation and experimentation. The compressed fuel bricks had grown from that simple process. Years later, when new settlers arrived in Prairie Basin, many of them were already familiar with the method. Pressed fuel bricks had become a quiet part of prairie life, passed from neighbor to neighbor without much ceremony. The original sandstone pressing slab Clara had found near dry Cartonwood Creek remained beside her shed, worn smooth from years of use. It was a simple tool, but with it she had solved a problem that once threatened every winter night on the prairie. And because of that small discovery, many fires across Prairie Basin no longer went out before morning. Stories like this show how simple ideas helped people survive on the frontier. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Also write in the comments where you are watching from.